Welcome to our research seminar of the CPCT, the Center of Philosophy and Critical Theory at Goldsmiths. Firstly, some quick housekeeping. We record this research seminar. If you later on in the Q&A want to speak and you don't want it to be recorded, just let us know. We've disabled all the functionalities at the moment, so the audience is not able to turn on the videos or the speakers or use the chat, but we will enable those things for the Q&A. So if things don't work at the moment for you, that's correct. That's not a mistake. So before we start, I want to just make two quick announcements of upcoming events. Firstly, we have the Goldsmiths Annual Philosophy Lecture coming up in May, on the 7th and 8th of May, which is given by Linda Martin-Elkoff this year. The information are in the chat, and that's in person in London at UCL. And then secondly, on Monday, we had an in-person event under the title Translating China in the Changing Political Economy, 1920s to 2020s. And the recording of that is also now online on our YouTube channel and to be found on the website cpct.uk. So that's just by means of announcements, because towards the end of these Zoom sessions, sometimes people leave early and so on. So it's better to do that at the beginning. But now I want to welcome you all for the reason that you are here, namely to participate in our research seminar on what is global critical theory. And I'm really, really pleased to welcome Lucie Mercier today, who is presenting her research on Fanon to us today under the title Frantz Fanon and the Critical History of Philosophy. Lucie is a senior researcher at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. She was previously a lecturer and research fellow at the CRMEP, the Center for Research in Modern European Philosophy here in London. She was also a visiting fellow at the University of Paris 8 and at the program in critical theory at the UC Berkeley. And there are two recently published articles of Lucie's that speak very directly to the topics of today's discussions. One article, The Translatability of Experience on Fanon's Language Puzzle, and the other one under the title Warding Off the Ghosts in the Historiography of Philosophy. Lucie is a member of Radical Philosophy and is currently working on a book-length project on Fanon's philosophy, of which we are today kind of in the luxury of hearing some of that work that's going into that book. So Lucie, I'll pass over to you. We'll have a lecture, a presentation of 45 to 50 minutes, and then time for Q&A after. And if you have questions during Lucie's presentation, there is the Q&A function, so you're also very welcome to type your questions as they come up, and then we can revisit them in the Q&A. Over to you.
Hi. Thank you so much, Svenja. Sorry, I just have a problem with, screen. So thank you so much, Svenja, and the whole team of the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought at Goldsmiths for giving me this opportunity to present my ongoing work in progress rather than research, I would say. It's a very open and ongoing investigation still, and very incomplete, as you will notice. So I will appreciate any constructive criticism. And I hope you'll be able to fill in. We can maybe fill in some of the gaps during the Q&A. So it is okay. So in this talk, I will try and grapple with the question of how to read Fanon from the standpoint of the history of philosophy. And in doing so, I will not be focusing on Fanon's actuality, that is on the way in which his text resonates, illuminates the broken present. My approach is epistemological and historical. To borrow from Walter Benjamin, I won't be focusing on the dialectical images conveyed by our reading on Fanon, but instead consider Fanon's philosophy as something like a monad of historical legibility. I'm here referring especially to Benjamin's writings on the task of the critique. I am interested in how Fanon's works provide prisms in which different currents of contemporary global critical thought have seen their own reflection and found the originating point of their own philosophical project. My aim is not to provide a comprehensive reception history of Fanon's writings, which would be impossible, but to give an account of why and how interpretations of Fanon's philosophy have come to function as a sort of theoretical shifter amongst theoretical positions and as a ground for new movements or schools of critical thought. Besides Fanon's crucial importance in grounding these late 20th century critical discourses, thinking, for example, of the critical philosophy of race, but also post-colonial and decolonial studies, Black studies, Africana philosophy, and many others. I am also interested in the kind of role played by Frantz Fanon works within disciplinary philosophy and the history of post-Kantian critical philosophy more specifically. Whilst Fanon's belonging to the history of philosophy might now appear obvious inasmuch as his texts are being taught in philosophy departments across the globe, this has not always been the case. For a long time, references to Fanon's philosophy were rare, and still very few monographs on Fanon have ever borne philosophy in their title. Fanon never called himself a philosopher, and he seldom referred to philosophy as a disciplinary or historical entity, though he made abundant references to philosophers and philosophical concepts across his works. And yet, though Fanon seemed uninterested in meta-theoretical questions pertaining to the kind of disciplinary discourse he was making use of, his works have de facto become pivotal to the transformation of philosophy over the past few decades. But how, in this recent investiture, has the figure of Fanon the philosopher been constructed? My guiding intuition here is that this construction is always circularly premised upon a certain conception of race, colonial difference, and of what a philosophical tradition is, which I find quite interesting and urgent to clarify. Since reading Fanon philosophically often amounts to addressing the way in which he read the works of canonical philosophers or inscribed himself within specific historical philosophical traditions, phenomenology, existentialism, Marxism, and so on, a crucial difficulty consists in making sense of Fanon's philosophy through these traditions of the history of philosophy without subsuming it under them. So the other key word in this discussion is the word derivative. Fanon shouldn't be seen as a derivative thinker. So I'll go back to this later. In this regard, it might be useful to remember that the proliferation of isms, so existentialisms, Marxism, etc., in the 19th century coincided with the professionalization of philosophy and the development of the very idea of a philosophical canon. Schools or movements to which philosophers belong have since tended to be perceived as allegiances that, unlike religion, culture, or identity, are supposed to be disinterested and neutral choices. But these genealogies are always, in a way, racially and culturally overcoded as patriarchal families of spirit in which one truly deserves implicitly one's own ancestors. For this reason, the form of association in this dissociation between Fanon and European philosophy is at the crux of the debate. As there is no obvious blueprint on how to account for filiations across cultural or racial difference, spelling out these continuities and discontinuities also requires an interpretation of Fanon's particular epistemic positioning vis-à-vis the tradition and vis-à-vis philosophy. This confrontation has triggered a series of important metonymic transfers. Fanon's voice becomes exemplary of how a Black or colonized subject confronts European philosophy's particular parochiality. So I'm just going to show you my outline. So I'll just share my screen. So now you can see, oh yeah, you can see. Okay. So I wanted to start by this epigraph by Rebecca Comey. I hope that you can read properly on your screens. So this is the plan of my talk. Okay, and then I think, I don't know whether it's best to just, because I'm not gonna use the PowerPoint for a long time and then use it with quotations towards the only in part 4. So I think I'm just gonna close it and continue to speak without any text in front of you. So I'll begin by presenting what I consider to be the central contradiction related to the critical history of philosophy today. To be clear, the critical history of philosophy is not a program, has no theory. It is an ongoing attempt on the part of a number of philosophers and people interested in philosophy, mostly in the post-Kantian critical tradition, to transform the practice of the history of philosophy. It designates something like the reflexive transformation of the history of philosophy under the pressure of Black radical, anti-colonial, and feminist movements in particular, which have forced philosophy to integrate a whole new set of problems within its purview, and by this token, forced the history of philosophy to reflect anew on its own premises and practices. In my view, this reflexive transformation gives rise to a dual antinomic movement as regard to the canon. On the one hand, this concern with what modern European philosophy has historically excluded leads to the spectacular proliferation and diversification of the philosophical archive. The broadening of the field of the history of philosophy to women philosophers, as well as beyond the Euro-American sphere, is rapidly progressing in the academic world and within transnational philosophical institutions. By seeking to escape its own power of exclusion, the history of philosophy is proceeding, seemingly, to the deconstruction of its elementary units one by one, its texts, its works, its proper names, its languages. This decomposition and recomposition of the philosophical tradition, which was already at the heart of archaeological, deconstructive, and minority practices in the age of post-structuralism, is re-established today from a political, strategic, and methodological premise. For the feminist historian of philosophy Marie-Frédérique Pellegrin, for example, I quote, "The historian of philosophy bears the responsibility of reflecting on the criteria which govern the constitution of corpuses of philosophy so that they constitute conscious choices which can be discussed and defended rationally." End of quote. The destruction and deconstruction of the philosophical canon is at the crux of this enterprise, for the point is both to raise awareness and to problematize the intrinsic normativity and forms of gatekeeping that philosophy and its history maintain. Yet, on the other hand, The announced explosion of the canon does not have the effects that one might expect. New histories proliferate without leading to the abolition of the canon. The European canon, and specifically of post-Kantian critical philosophy, remains both an essential site of power and of its subversion. At the level of institutions, and although the fight against racial and gender bias are now included in various key charters of the history of philosophy, I'm thinking of congresses, journals, the APA website, and things like that, the specific normativity of excellence and competitiveness remains more or less intact at the national level. As a sufficient proof of this is that those who come from diversity cannot fail to arrive at philosophy through its European canon if they want to have their intellectual competencies recognized. But also outside of strictly institutional dynamics, the taking or overtaking of the canonical history of philosophy has never been strategic, it seems, than in the era of feminist, Black, intersectional, and post-colonial theory. We observe the continued power of the canon of the history of modern critical philosophy, Kant, Hegel, Marx, which often, for disciplines adjacent to philosophy, seem to summarize the history of philosophy itself. Trained in a critical tradition through literature, Gayatri Spivak, for instance, considers that philosophy is a bad abstraction. The question for her is not so much to decolonize philosophy by amplifying minoritized philosophies, as to reread and deconstruct the post-Kantian canon in the light of literary texts, as many singularities which put it in crisis. What I would like to stress here is that we can understand the critical history of philosophy from both angles. Either it is first and foremost a critical history or historiography which questions the grounds upon which this history is constructed, or what is at stake is the critique of a certain narrative of the history of philosophy, insofar as the latter played the role of a complex civilizational matrix. What would therefore be at stake is a struggle for critical hegemony over a whole of the history of philosophy, and not the questioning of every and each of its entities. Well before these recent upheavals, this antinomy was decisive in the development of Black philosophical and critical thought, which in its own terms has reflected since the beginning of the 20th century on ways of producing forms of philosophical counter-hegemonies. While in the predominantly French-speaking African context, the question of philosophy and the debate around its definition have been formative. In the English-speaking Black radical tradition, the struggle was initially less about the very notion of philosophy than around Marxism and its tradition in a broad sense. It seems that Fanon, just like Aimé Césaire, stood at the intersection between these two cultures. Without explicitly posing the problem of philosophy as an institution, as a discourse, Fanon without explicitly posing the problem of philosophy as an institution, the question of philosophical discourse, its universalist and self-legitimizing structure, have played a fundamental role in his thinking. Rather than thematizing it, Fanon interestingly staged the problem of the right to philosophy. That's an expression from Derrida. The right to philosophy for colonial and post-colonial subjects through spectacular interlocutions, for example, and more specifically with Sartre and Hegel. In several ways, the work of Fanon and its commentaries crystallize the paradoxes inherent in the effort to transform and decolonize the history of philosophy. By its strong incarnation and influence, this work is exemplary. It has become the symbol of a major reversal in the political order and in the order of knowledge, an epistemological break of sorts. But Fanon's close relationship to the European canon of philosophy has always been debated and still remains a source of perplexity among commentators. How are we to think about Fanon in the history of philosophy and in the history of critique? How should we grasp the epistemological rupture of which he was both the author and the actor? So I move now to the third part, which is called a Fanonian epistemology ? We know almost nothing about the relationship that Fanon had with philosophy and its history. Fanon was interested in both philosophy and sociology, to the point of attending Maurice Merleau-Ponty's and André Leroy-Gouan's lectures in Lyon, alongside his studies in psychiatry. But Fanon was very little interested in disciplinary issues, and even less in those affecting academic philosophy, which, it must be remembered, did not have a good press at the end of the Second World War. While philosophers seemed to live, in Paul Nizan's words, in a climate preserved from disasters, it was instead literature which was at the vanguard of political commitment. Fanon always and above all considered himself as a psychiatrist, even if it was a psychiatry which, following Toscaya's model, was to be thought from a political standpoint and to constantly draw on foreign materials, art, theater, and philosophy, among others. Fanon's theoretical practice was characterized by urgency. He dictated his text to loyal secretaries to whom he spoke his books without the slightest paper in hand, whilst walking during his break times before or after the clinic. Marie-Jeanne Manuelan, who typed Sociology of a Revolution and Wretched of the Earth, added that Fanon seldom reread himself, and that the first draft was the right one. In all appearance, his writing practice consisted of transforming an inner thought into living expression, one capable of touching readers effectively. Faithful to this mode of writing, his theoretical thought, oriented towards action, is not very reflexive. Fanon rarely turns back to correct or criticize himself, leaving us in the dark as to his methods. Not entering the sphere of justification is also a way of short-circuiting institutional recognition. A philosophical reading of Fanon is therefore required to produce the discourse of this absence, that is to say, to reconstruct the set of strategies, approaches, or languages that Fanon practiced without thematizing. So in order to fill in this gap in a way, or deal with this absence, all the commentators that I will now present have turned their attention to the form of Fanon's discourse, following the hypothesis that it would contain either an implicit epistemology or a philosophical method that would be worth unraveling. I'll now go back to my PowerPoint. And move to the next part. Yeah. So I wish to present in this part two types of interpretations of Fanon's epistemic break or rupture. We will see that for the first two, so Mathieu Renaud and Gavin Arnal, Fanon's view of epistemic rupture is reconstructed and modeled upon his philosophy of history, which encompasses a theory of cultural transformation more generally. Fanon's most spectacular formulations of epistemological rupture arguably appears in the conclusion of Wretched of the Earth, where Fanon exhorts his readers to leave Europe. Oh no, I don't have it, but I'm going to read it. So I quote from Wretched of the Earth, the conclusion: "Let us decide not to imitate Europe, and let us tense our muscles and our brains in a new direction. Let us endeavor to invent a new man, something which Europe has been incapable of achieving." End of quote. So I apologize in advance to all those of you who wanted a much more in-depth analysis of Fanon's text, because it's not what I've done here. Because as I'm working on reception, I've focused on these quotations that are the crux of debates, of polemics. So I'm very sorry, it's a kind of Reader's Digest of Fanon and not the philological Fanon, which I'm extremely interested in, and which of course is part of the project. But in a way, this is the kind of it's an attempt at framing my own approach. So that's why it's like that. So I just read you this part of the conclusion of Wretched of the Earth. And Mathieu Renaud shows that the sticking point in the interpretations of this passage concerns not just Fanon's conception of the rupture with Europe, but also his vision of the new beginning, anti or post-colonial. More than the concluding argument of the work, Renaud reads Fanon's exhortation in the light of a pattern of rupture beginning which inhabits all of his writings, a process of decolonization, disalienation that pertains at once to subjectivities and to the objective realm, meaning the social, the cultural, the linguistic. For Renaud, this pattern constitutes Fanon's creative subversion of the Hegelian dialectic, a variational reinterpretation of Hegelian themes which both thematize and enact the logic of displacements that are at stake in epistemic decolonization. It is interesting then to realize that Gavin Arnald's Subterranean Fanon, an underground theory of radical change, which is more recent, focuses on a similar question. But here it is centered not on this couple rupture, new beginning, but on the concept of change. So like Renaud, Gavin Arnald not only is interested in the question of change across Fanon's works, but also takes up Fanon's Hegelianism as interpretive key. And of course, these two choices are correlated, I think. Hegel's dialectic indeed provides a unique paradigm to think change or transformation as such, in general, across Fanon's writings on the psyche, on culture, society, and politics. In other words, it bestows, even negatively, a certain recognizable form onto Fanon's philosophy. Yet, Arnald considers that Fanon's theory of change is itself double. For him, Fanon's dialectical thinking also contains an anti-dialectical Nietzschean undercurrent, which sometimes emerges as an explicit conflict but remains most often underground. Sometimes Fanon can appear openly conflictual and antagonistic towards his own ideas, whereas at other moments, seemingly irreconcilable formulations coexist and even mutually enrich each other. More frequently, however, the characteristic dividedness of Fanon's oeuvre gains expression through the introduction of a term, image, or metaphor that reads like a symptomatic slip, revealing an underground current of thought flowing through the entirety of his writings. Both Renaud and Arnald hold that the problem of the decolonial rupture raised by Fanon is not confined to the historical process of decolonization, but is redoubled at the epistemological level. Interestingly, to think this kind of mediation at the epistemological level, they both draw on the concept metaphor of translation, but in different ways. Arnald, on the one hand, models his concept of translation directly upon Fanon's own claim to stretch Marxism and his own interpretation of the dialectic. I quote, he writes, Arnald, to theorize is to translate, to dialectically convert any inherited doctrine into a new version of itself so as to place it in the service of the struggle for liberation. Renaud, for his part, accentuates his spatial, perspectival, and therefore anti-dialectical character of translation. And he writes, these theoretical displacements, rather than overcoming, reveal the complexity of post-colonial geography, places of speech and knowledge that no longer necessarily coincide with territories and their borders. While conceptual or intellectual relationships over time tend to be overcoded by ideas of filiation, which always refer to the idea of a capital or heritage to be preserved by descendants, translation would point to a form of filiation without blood connection, a horizontal filiation across the interstices of languages. This passage through language as medium allows us to think about a form of profound historicity, which does not immediately fall back onto the notion of culture. It brings Fanon's difference as philosopher to bear on an abstract level, which is neither racial nor cultural. In this sense, Fanon would always already find himself in a position of relative exteriority vis-à-vis the discourses he commented upon, neither entirely inside nor entirely outside. However, a translational conception of the history of philosophy has two natural tendencies. On the one hand, it poses, even to transform it, the problem in terms of a relationship to an original. On the other hand, by emphasizing the journey of effective translations, rather than the experience of untranslatability that each given situation poses, it tends to erase the moment of invention. This is a point that Gavin Arnall himself underscored. Considering that Fanon's purely affirmative conception of change, I quote, makes the concept of translation itself inadequate because it conceives the new as detached from all previous conditions without original, end of quote. It is then no longer a question of, I quote, assimilation, tradition, and translation, but of starting from nothing, of a new beginning, because to theorize is to invent, end of quote. How can we think of the Fanonian rupture as a true invention? How are we to read Fanon's works through the prism of invention while also locating him within the history of philosophy? And so to try and answering and following with this question, I'd like to discuss now the readings of two other prominent scholars of Fanon, namely Louis Gordon and David Mercier. The reading of Fanon undertaken by Louis Gordon since the 1990s is both phenomenological and existential. It places the emphasis on Fanon's debts to Husserl, Sartre, and Jaspers, while affirming the radical novelty of his thought. For Gordon, the unraveling of a Fanonian theory of method mostly depends on a close reading of the introduction of Black Skin, White Masks, as well as on a reflection on the very construction of Fanon's discourse. In the first place, he interprets Fanon's famous methodological disclaimer, which I have put on the PowerPoint, as a negative theory of philosophical method. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this quotation from Black Skin, White Masks. Against the discourses of method, Fanon would have developed an attitude of, I quote, embodied interrogatives. As Gordon writes, I quote, to evaluate method, the best method is the suspension of method. Do I have it? No, I don't. This paradox leads to a demand for radical anti-colonial critique. But for such a reflection to be radical, it must also make even logic itself suspect. End of quote. In Gordon's account, what plays a hegemonic role in Fanon's discourse is not so much the canon as methods themselves, and in the first place, the methods of disciplinary philosophy, which shall therefore be suspended. From this methodological suspension, Gordon proceeds to the reconstruction of the various planes of Fanon's philosophy, beginning from its foundation in lived experience up to the meta-philosophical level. In the second place, Gordon draws a great deal on how Fanon problematizes the question of blackness through the motive of failure. I quote. So I quote Fanon's introduction of Black Skin, White Masks, where he writes, Fanon, if the debate cannot be opened up on a philosophical level, i.e. the fundamental demands of human reality, I agree to place it on a psychoanalytical level. In other words, the failures, just as we talk about an engine misfiring. End of quote. For Gordon, failure is a fundamental element of the Fanonian text in that it proceeds to the doubling of his discourse. I quote Gordon, "The use of humor and the scale of metatextual critique of the unusual relationship of the author to his own text is what differentiates Fanon's work as something unseen before. Here one could even think of European existentialists such as Søren Kierkegaard, who used techniques of what he called indirection, and Friedrich Nietzsche, who claimed to have been breaking idols, whose ideas and approaches also appear in Black Skin, White Masks. But that ironic relationship of failure, that tension between the author of versus the author in the work, and what they manifest politically and even intellectually, places Fanon's work in a class of its own. In this way, Gordon shows that there is an implicit problematization of philosophy at the very heart of Fanon's mode of writing, a metaphilosophical commentary. Since the 1990s, Louis Gordon's works around Fanon has gradually given rise to a metaphilosophical reflection around Afrikaner philosophy, in which Fanon is an exemplary figure. Gordon initially drew on Lucius Outlaw, who had defined Afrikaner philosophy as a disciplinary field of study encompassing all the philosophy produced by African or African descendant people, whether they are considered philosophical in the traditional sense or not. To this definition, Gordon added that Afrikaner philosophy includes three distinct thematic axes: one, philosophical anthropology; two, the theory of liberation; and three, the metacritique of reason. It is in this metacritique of reason that a reflection on epistemic decolonization and a reflexive questioning around the lived experience of race and Blackness between a political epistemology of decolonization and a situated phenomenology of race appear to coincide. Just as in his reading of the introduction to Black Skin, White Masks, these two levels of discourse seem to be grounded on one another. The decolonial reduction as an epistemological gesture of returning to the reality of experience is thereby exactly correlated with the existential phenomenological refoundation of a new philosophy that is more authentic and closer to reality. The meaning of Fanon's epistemic break is therefore not to be found in the multiple repetition and ruptures that he marks between his thought and the European canon, that he would have criticized, but on the side of the starting again or reinvention, both existential and Afro-diasporic, of philosophy. I now move to Marriott with another extremely famous quotation of Black Skin, White Masks. In terms diametrically opposed to those of Louis Gordon, David Marriott also takes up the experience of Blackness as a keystone, but emphasizing the truly abysmal character of this experience, he suggests remaining in this interruption rather than reading it as leading towards something else. His interpretation deviates from the three previous ones in that it seeks to wrench Fanonism from any philosophical or teleological overcoding and to favor a psychoanalytic and poetic reading of Blackness, more apt, in his view, to capture the specificity of the Fanonian text and above all, its formal undecidability. As for invention, it is not to be read in the sense of what inaugurates, but of what is undecidable. And here I have a quotation that I find interesting by him. If, as Derrida rightly says, one of the paradoxes of invention is that for it to be inaugural, it must be accorded a status or recognition, and consequently this is why the first time of invention never creates existence. For Fanon, by contrast, the introduction of invention into existence is already an act of resistance, even if it is not recognized as such. Indeed, it would seem that what he wants to value as endless self-creation would necessarily have to escape the very concept of event and accessorily all the attendant metaphorics of becoming and transfiguration to be an invention worthy of the name. In opposition to historical becoming, he writes, there had always been the unforeseeable. In doing so, Merriot follows a quite different path from post-colonial and decolonial readings of Fanonism in seeking to characterize the philosophical break or breach opened by Fanon, mostly from the vantage point of black skin, white masks. His reading draws on Fanon's refusal of being determined by history, blackness no longer having anything to do with historical determination, comes to mean something like contingency itself. The I in movement, the undecidable, or Merriot writes, philosophy itself in its critical side. For Merriot, blackness has neither the form of a point of view nor that of an experience, but rather the deconstructive, something like the deconstructive form of an unthought. For him, the question of Fanon's relationship to the European canon does not constitute a central problem because his thought is at no time objectified within a relationship of filiation, but remains at the stage of crisis, indecision, or distension between philosophy and its place of enunciation. With these comments, while these commentaries claim a certain critical relevance to the thought of Frantz Fanon, their comparison reveals marked differences in possible approaches to the rupture initiated by Fanon in the history of philosophy. While Renaud, and to a lesser extent Arnal, approach it from the point of view of a historical epistemology, Gordon and Marriott problematize in respectively opposite senses the Fanonian rupture as suspension or origin in a phenomenological or deconstructive sense. Rather than as historian of philosophy, they read Fanon through the prism of the critical relevance of his thinking on race and blackness. But while Gordon's project clearly steps away from critique in favor of philosophy, Merriott seems to think that what blackness gives rise to is perhaps not so much a new philosophy than a new practice of philosophy, one that would be perhaps done under the heading of Black Studies. Each of the four constructions that I've just enumerated seems to help us characterize the novelty or originality of Fanon's critical project in light of something like an anthropological meta-category. Fanon is either viewed as a sort of translator and mediator of European truth, or rather as a sort of, in Gordon's case in particular, as a kind of myth of origins or ancestor. And on the concept of ancestor, there are a few texts that I could talk about if you're interested. So now, I don't know how I am with time, but it's 10 to 6, 10 to 5 for you.
You can take until the hour, I would say. We started kind of like 10 past at the earliest.
Okay, then I can finish. It's also that my last part is completely experimental because it's so experimental, I've just put down my little schema. The schema that kind of is at the ground or at the back of my my mind. Especially, I mean, I was especially interested in how all these concepts of critique circulate and are different from one another or the same, etc. And so that's a very broad and complicated project, of course. So I'd be interested in having your thoughts on the ground of my schema. But as a way of starting to grapple with this problem, I just wanted to make a short excursus on critique, on the concept of critique, which is very provisional again. I would like to point to a crucial difficulty pertaining to the intrinsic dynamics of the concept of critique. Critique is a notoriously overdetermined term. When we want to disambiguate it, it is most often not through an analytic definition, but through a number of historically prominent cases, proper names of the European tradition, either Kant or Marx or the Frankfurt School, and to whom we might add Foucault and a few others. For this reason, critique shall only be defined through a specific topic. Depending on which reference is privileged, it is the reflexive character, or to the contrary, its objective and practical task, its relationship to philosophy, or instead to the social and political sciences that is emphasized. But matters become even more difficult when we zoom in into the works of each of these proper names, so to speak, to realize that the concept is itself multiple in each, as if its role was precisely, the role of the concept was precisely to preclude any complete self-analysis. And it is, and so as a starter of a broader conversation, I have a few quotations from contemporary characterizations of critique, which I find interesting to share. It is noteworthy that in December 2023, the entry Critical Theory of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which had been authored by Robin Selicates in 2005, was substituted by another entry titled Critical Theory, in parentheses, Frankfurt School. In the 2005 entry, critical theory had both a narrow and a broad meaning, the narrow being the Frankfurt School and the broad being its various other contemporary instantiations. In the 2023 entry, co-authored by Robin Selicates and Jeffrey Flynn, this narrow versus broad use of the term was formalized through capitalization. While critical theory is often thought of narrowly as referring to the Frankfurt School that begins with Horkheimer and Adorno and stretches to Marcuse and Habermas, any philosophical approach with similar practical aims could be called a critical theory, including feminism, critical race theory, and some forms of post-colonial criticism. In the following, critical theory, when capitalized, refers only to the Frankfurt School. All other uses of the term are meant in the broader sense and thus not capitalized. When used in the singular, a critical theory is not capitalized even when the theory is developed by members of the Frankfurt School in the context of their overall project of critical theory. Sorry, so that's, I didn't refer it well. So this is the current text, the current article on critical theory. So its title also has Frankfurt School into parentheses. So I find interesting that at the moment, so this article, I must also add, is much longer and much more expansive on this other tradition of these other forms and these other traditions of critical theory than the former one. And it's interesting that as it is expanding its scope, this article needs also to safeguard a certain hierarchical relation between the original historical tradition and its subsequent extensions. Another interesting example, in my view, is to be found in contemporary definitions of critical philosophy of race. For example, in his recent anthology that's titled Critical Philosophy of Race, Robert Bernasconi writes, critical philosophy of race calls itself critical not only because it investigates and attacks racisms wherever they may be found, but also in recognition of the pioneering work done both by critical race theory within legal studies, which is the forerunners of work in this area, and by critical theory, the Frankfurt School, into parentheses. So again, the way in which the concept of critique work through models, through analogons, so it works like an analogon, is interesting. In a similar vein, in her own entry for the Stanford Encyclopedia, Linda Martin-Alcoff wrote the following: thus, the critical philosophy of race offers a critical analysis of the concept as well as of certain philosophical problematics regarding race. In this approach, it takes inspiration from critical legal studies and the interdisciplinary scholarship in critical race theory, both of which explore the way in which social ideologies operate covertly in the mainstream formulations of apparently neutral concepts such as merit or freedom. While borrowing from these approaches, the critical philosophy of race has a distinctive philosophical methodology, primarily drawing from critical theory. It's the first to be named: Marxism, pragmatism, phenomenology, post-structuralism, psychoanalysis, and hermeneutics, even while subjecting these traditions to critique for their omissions in regard to specifically racial forms of domination and the resultant inadequacy of their conceptual framework. In these definitions, the Frankfurt School style of critique and others remain an analogon, a model, but one that must itself be subjected to another critique. But here we may ask, critique in which sense? Is it just a question of contesting its validity, of populating it with new particulars? Or is the problem to be located deeper at the level of the very concept of critique and its philosophical, historical encoding? If Fanon's thought became a paradoxical model, a new analogon, as it were, for new philosophical critical forms, what does it tell us about critique? That's the question. The answer, in my view, is that, or one of the answers, would be that Fanon offers a unique prism to reflect on something like a meta-anthropological determination of the history of philosophy as critical discourse, namely what we can code through issues of to terms like filiation, ancestry, heritage, which are, willingly or not, surreptitiously reproduced within the discourse of critique. And here I again point to that initial quotation epigraph by Rebecca Comey, which encapsulates very well this strange relationship between the writing of the history of philosophy and its imaginary that is in her, that is full of metaphors, of qualities, of elusive images, etc. Of course, there's a very large literature on this, on the images and the metaphors that are carried, that are both central to the history of philosophy, central to the history of concept, and even central to the historiography of philosophy. We can think, for example, of Michel Ledeuf works on more on the side of gender. I guess one of the things I would like to say is that Fanon's, we can read Fanon in a way that that brings out this dimension of the history of philosophy. So to conclude by going back to where I started, I'd like to say that through these different readings of Fanon, there are also different conceptions of the way in which the critical history of philosophy can or must take up the critique of race. Should we thwart the methodological nationalism and anthropological essentialisms of Western history of philosophy by using new methods and epistemologies to, in a way, repair exclusion or shape new topographies of history? Or should we instead orient the critical history of philosophy towards the concept of race or the concept of gender, directing thought towards these concepts, not to be sure not to neglect them? That's one of the proposals of Stella Sanford in in an article for the journal Critical Philosophy of Race. How can we redefine a concept of critique capable of connecting the projects of a critical philosophy of race and a critical history of philosophy? In the light of these readings of Fanon, it seems that a difficult question for any critical history of philosophy is whether this reaffirmation of critique as an epistemological weapon can ultimately avoid being caught up by its own trace. So I'm going to end here. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me, Lucie, do you want to stop the screen sharing for a second? Ah, yes, so I can, perfect. Thank you so much. That was a tour de force, and I think a lot to discuss on the different parts of your presentation. I would say we have a good half an hour for discussion. There are currently no questions in the Q&A. What I will do is I will enable for all participants that you can all speak and put your camera on if you like. And I would say just raise your hands if you'd like to speak. I will also enable the chat so you can post questions in the chat as well if you don't want to speak them. So just give me 1 second. Okay. I think that should work. Are people able to raise their hand if they would like to speak? That's one of the questions I have. Ah, is that a question? No, okay. We'll give it a couple of minutes so everyone can digest and we can figure out the functionality. Okay, are there questions, comments? Hi, Sultan. Alberto, do you want to start us off? I saw a hand.
I can. That was great. Thanks a lot, Lucie. I was wondering about how you evaluate the kind of anti-methodological and which I suppose one could say also perhaps anti-critical in terms of a certain normative or reflexive or transcendental critiques sense of the term in Fanon. And I was particularly struck by his use of this very peculiar verb from physiology, résorber, to resorb, which just to remind myself, I found the very interesting definition, right? To remove a structure by gradual breakdown into component materials and dispersal in the circulation. And I thought, well, it's a fabulous way of thinking, right? Like what it might mean to not just to deny or repel the demand for reflexivity or methodology and so on, but to metabolize it in a different way. And I was wondering if you think that that is a thread that can be, you know, that can be drawn through Fanon's work. And I guess secondly, whether that's a proposal that those various authors you deal with, right? So Arnaud, Reynaud, Marriott, and Gordon, whether their efforts speak to that, or whether they're not kind of trying to maybe bring, like, not external, because, you know, they're all things that Fanon is in dialogue with, phenomenology, Hegelianism, anti-dialectics, and etc. But like whether they're not trying to sort of, you know, do a kind of I guess, like a philosophy for, the way that Althusser talks about, making a philosophy for Marxism or for Marx, right? Like that they're kind of like creating this module through which then Fanon might become differently intelligible, rather than maybe being true to this very sui generis demand to resorb philosophy into something else, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's completely relevant. And in a way, because I started off from this question of methodology and from the canon, I didn't go into that because in a way I left suspended the question as to whether Fanon is the new man he's talking about, is the question of, because Fanon invokes transformation, he evokes revolution, invokes a transformation of in language, etc. Does he succeed? So either you go with this effectively, and because you treat him as an absolute reference, as a starting point, then you can take the effectivity of his text, so the text as it is for this metabolized version of philosophy, which is and is not at the same time philosophy, which is a philosophy which is critical of itself, etc. Or you stay at the level of wondering about the text in its much more awkward and unrealized, or unfinished dimensions, I guess. And I think what I like with Marriott's reading is that he very much, although in a way he really takes Fanon as this absolute reference, and his recent book also seems to points in that direction, that Fanon's concepts really remain at the heart of what he's trying to do. There is an attention for the textual indetermination and problems within the text that I find really helpful for us, and that's also in kind of contrasting him and Gordon. That was also at stake, is that there's a kind of overwriting of Gordon on Fanon to, in a way, to in a way enact this epistemological break. So it's, I think it's a very, using also, of course, all these readings, and perhaps most of all, Mathieu Renaud's reading uses quite a lot Fanon's own conceptual inventions as starting point, and that's very productive too. But it also requires us to think that the question of whether Fanon, the question of whether Fanon, what Fanon does as a text doesn't really matter. What matters is that we want to use it philosophically. Hence, any of these terms coming from psychoanalysis, coming from psychiatry, coming from can just be channeled in this way. So I don't know. I'm leaving all these possibilities open in a way, but. I guess if you really want to raise the question of philosophy, you have to pose it in that way, and you can't just take for granted. Again, it's not about only thinking about Fanon in terms of his philosophical actuality, but really its historicity. So, and the historicity of his own terms, etc. So. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered, but. Oh, I don't hear you, Svenja.
Thank you. Sorry, mistake. Mary, you also typed your some comments in the questions. Do you want to speak to them and maybe read them out, or whatever you think is best?
Okay. Fanon seems to have leapt from Hegel over Marx completely. thereby dispensing of the valuable tools of Marxian dialectic, namely praxis via synthesis. And also, Fanon, surprisingly for me, does not seem to address the issue of internalization of the oppressor, the oppressive influences of culture, the limits of language. I'm thinking of Paulo Freire and Wittgenstein.
Lucie, do you want to respond straight away, or do you want to take a few comments together?
We can maybe.
Yeah. So there's also a comment by Christopher Chapman. Would you like to speak to this, or shall I just read it out? Christopher writes, I wonder what your intuition might be with respect to Fanon's understanding of humor. I hear Bergson's discussion in Laughter, where he explains the value of laughter for its disruption of pathological thought. Laughter allows us to suspend thought and see feel clinically. Wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Yeah,
So
that's very.
those are two.
Maybe I can start. Mary, I'm not sure whether there was a question. I think, the question of praxis, I think, is one of the main keys to Fanon's philosophy. So I don't quite understand what you mean in terms of over Marx. Of course, he didn't read all of Marx and was not, but not all of Hegel either. However, I think the concept of praxis is crucial. And then you talk about the internalization. I think I'm not sure. I would be interested if you do you have an article that talks about Paulo Freire and Wittgenstein in relation to the question of internalization? Because I think he does talk about the question of language a lot, and so I don't have enough elements. And about Lothar, it's interesting. It's funny. A friend of mine recently defended her PhD on humor, on post-colonial humor, which I'm sure would have a lot of interesting things to say. But indeed, you did grasp that I'm interested in the form. I'm interested in how we treat Fanon's philosophy discursively as a type of discourse, and the various interpretations that have been produced of this discourse. And I indeed wanted to focus on the question of dramaturgy and drama, in which, of course, Lothar is an essential dimension too. So I take your remark in, and we'll think about it more deeply.
But they really want them to be.
Could we mute? Can everyone mute themselves who isn't speaking, please, because there is a bit of background reverberation. Sultan, you have a question.
Thank you, Svenja. Thank you, Lucie, for this really wonderful lecture. I think I've never seen Fanon being so systematically presented and also shown in the different ways he was picked up by other thinkers. I do have a question about two things, actually. One is the discussions around Fanon today, which are very much centered on decolonization, which you did not fully go into. And with that, of course, also the question of translatability, because what Fanon was talking about was pretty much also informed by his own historical time, what he saw in Algeria. But also, of course, the conception of man, human, comes through a new humanism that he proposes. So I was wondering, how do you take that, his concept of decolonization, how do you view that? How do you have a discussion of that, given the kinds of discussions that have emerged around discussion, both kind of polemically, but also within. I don't know about critical race theory in that sense, because I mean, one could say critical race theory, obviously, but my second question actually goes with that field that you have delineated as critical race theory. But I think in terms of like a general rethinking of, you know, not just post-colonial literature and theory, but a general form of critical thinking, right? The other thing has to do with like the critical theory, especially the parts that you have showed us from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It was really interesting, actually, because it remains, I mean, in many ways, race becomes, like reading through it, I was wondering if we understand race through such categories, race itself becomes very objectified and separated from the understanding of race that Fanon actually proposes, which again is a different kind of humanism away from Eurocentric notions and colonialisms. Even the analysis of colonialism and capitalism, you know, put forth by Marx and others, remain quite racist, to put it very starkly, right? So here, I'm actually also interested in like how you think about, sorry, my daughter is also at home. I'm interested in like how you think about people like scholars like Sylvia Wynter, who have taken on Fanon and have actually developed really rich ideas about this new humanism that Fanon started to think with, and who have actually shown us ways to kind of get away from this legal notion, the critical race theory that you quote that goes back to intersectionality and what I assume like the school of Kimberly Crenshaw, really what comes through, but a broader notion of how to be human. So here my question is like, how do you bring that together? You're thinking of critical theory with regards to race, but Fanon actually talking about humanism. And also like in distinction to someone like David Mercier, who's very much invested in Blackness and psychoanalysis, right? So these are my thoughts. I find what you do very, very interesting. And I think it's incredibly systematic and very provocative. But I wondered about these two things.
Lucie, I feel like it was a big double question. I will let you answer and not take more for now.
Well, I mean, I guess what I understood your question to be about how you reconcile Fanon's own humanism as, in a way, the one that, in a way, he believed in his time, and how we take up his writings as foundation for these sort of new critical forms that don't seem to regard highly or have a high regard for humanism or for the new humanism that Fanon seemingly upheld. So there seems to be a contradiction between the afterlives of Fanon's text and the letter of his of their letter,
just to clarify,
yes,
I think he's very much upheld in high regard. He is upheld in high regard. Fanon is, I think,
but not the humanism to which he probably subscribed.
No, I think even the humanism, but it is even the humanism that he proposes. I mean, Sylvia Wynter has tried to develop his notion of the psychogenesis into like a sociogenesis, following him, saying this is not a psychiatric issue, it's the social issue, right? That has very much to do with how you are regarded as a race. So how can we actually take Fanon seriously and think with his conception of humanism wider and broader and continue to think with that? No, definitely. I think there's a lot of respect for Fanon here.
Yeah, no, it's not that I was talking about differing historical contexts in which some of these terms have meanings that gradually transform, and how do we reconcile this? But I mean, again, this is not a talk about Fanon's the actuality of specific aspects of his philosophy, and so it's hard for me to comment now on this, but I think that my approach, in a way, I wouldn't say it's a humanist approach, but the fact that I'm interested precisely in Fanon as a sort of point of encounter. I'm interested in Fanon and the literature of Fanon as a point of encounter between extremely different tendencies. And these tendencies are geographically coded or racially coded, or they are coded through various new categories, or categories which sometimes overlap and sometimes are antagonistic to one another. And I'm precisely interested in Fanon as this meeting ground. And I think that in a way, humanism and this sort of humanist telos is one of the reasons of a certain undetermination of his texts. This should be justified more, but so in a way, I think maybe there's this sort of openness in these texts, which then allowed the posterity to take up the different threads. But it's also the fragmentary nature of his text. But not only, I think there's something in the address that makes means that a lot of different a lot of different historically determined groups of people with various perspectives can then take up.
Okay, we have more questions in the chat. So there is a question by Chris, also a two-part question, which, Chris, I don't know if you want to speak to that, or you just want me to read it out, which I will do in a second. There is also more comments on Sylvia Wynter, if I scroll down to the end. So maybe as we are on the subject, maybe I read the last one out first and work myself back up to Chris's point. There is a comment, obviously one cannot include everything, but I'd be curious to know if you thought of including Sylvia Wynter in your presentation, just because she does exactly what you mentioned, take and expand the idea of a new man, specifically by expanding Fanon's reflection on sociogeny. So Blue's point also to the point Sultan just made. And then there are two comments by Ruth, which again, I don't know, Ruth, if you'd like to speak to that a bit more. I'm thinking of Denise Ferreira de Silva's project and the racial dialectic, and there is a kind of image or file posted of that project, I assume. So I think, Lucie, we'll keep that, and if you want to come back to that, please do. But I think I will now go and read out Chris's two-part question. Is part of the problem with receptions of Fanon based on academic specialization? Seems to lead to rather selective or incomplete presentations of his work. Fanon's own works clearly transcend these disciplines. And secondly, isn't the best way to understand Fanon's ruptures or uniqueness via a detailed understanding of his philosophical, political, historical context and interlocutors?
Yes, I would say yes to both. I guess, yes to the first, but in a way here, I was really focusing on four authors who have quite a deep philosophical training or set of references in their reading of Fanon. So I'm not really talking about different receptions in terms of various disciplines. And then the best way, ruptures and uniqueness. Yes, I mean, of course, the best way of understanding Fanon's philosophy is to deal with his texts in a contextual and detailed manner, etc. My question, I mean, my talk was here really talking both about Fanon and about what Fanon means for something else, which is in the context of the birth of these new practices of the history of philosophy, in which is a paradoxical figure. And starting from there, I think this whole, reflection on the significance of the canon, of the critical tradition in particular, and it's ever recurring, this sort of movement of recurrence and of return via its conceptuality, I think, was at the heart of my reflection. I'm interested in also how about the practice of philosophy today and towards the future, and what's the relationship with how we think our practice of philosophy and Fanon more particularly, because in some ways, if we stay within Fanon studies, there is something very in a way interesting and productive in the transdisciplinary nature of his philosophy, but there's also something not extremely original in the way he uses references, etc. So in the sense, not in the way he uses reference, but in his references. And so compared to what is done today under the heading of this broadening of philosophy and of its history that I was talking about in the beginning of the talk. So I was looking at all these, different contradictions and elements, but it's an ongoing and it's very collective problem, I guess. But then I also have my own idea of how I think Fanon should be interpreted, or which interpretations are more relevant or better than others. But I wasn't committed in this talk to really outline that at all, and using the other readings as lenses upon this, the way various contemporary philosophers and thinkers grapple with this transformation of philosophy and critique, and how the reading of Fanon reveals something about that. Amam.
Hamam, go on. Nice to see you.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I can't, for some reason, I can't see myself, but maybe that's for the better. Hello, Lucie. It's good to see you. Thank you for your talk. My question is underdeveloped, so apologies in advance. But if I'm not mistaken, at one point you make reference to Michel Serres' concept of transdisciplinarity as relative exteriority. And I'm wondering if Serres gives you a model to precisely get out of this impasse or this paradox that animates your paper. So I'm wondering if you can be more honest and reveal your debt to Serres, but to use this particular. I mean, it appears very enigmatically in this short précis on Leibniz that he writes, but I'm wondering if you can develop that thought for us here, precisely as a model that helps you out of this impasse or this paradox that you that drives your research into Fanon. Thank you, and I'm running out of battery. Thank you.
I wonder, Lucie, do you want to answer that? I have a question as well, but I can let you answer, or I can add it, but it's gonna not go to Serres, so maybe you want to do that first.
That's okay. You can. Yeah, I'll remember this question.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, Thank you so much. I feel like it's maybe a question or a comment or something, because first of all, I really appreciate how you have tackled the question of Fanon because I suppose also in the context of this seminar where we've kind of set us this impossible question, what is global critical theory, which, I don't even think in any Q&A we've actually addressed. I feel like you've pushed us towards that space where we cannot just ask, what is Fanon's theory of philosophy, or however we want to call it, but actually, how does one do something within that space? And is there a way to even capture it meta-theoretically? So I think even, for me, what you've done today is not just trying to do that, but also to ask the question, like, can we actually do that? And what do we gain, but also what are the impasses while we do, or what are the difficulties that we come up against? And I suppose what struck me specifically was this juxtaposition that on the one hand, you started by putting at the center of your talk the question of the critical history of philosophy. What is a critical history of philosophy? Where does Fanon sit within that? And then you came to the other part where you said, actually, Fanon produced his work with a huge amount of urgency. He dictated, he didn't really have time to self-reflect, which suggests kind of that already the exercise that we are doing now is kind of a bit crazy because it just tries to do something to this work that is absolutely in a way alien to its own kind of mode of production. And how you went from there all the way to the end to critique reminded me of something that I'm kind of thinking about a lot and kind of trying to work with, which is the problem of critique in kind of the Marxist tradition and thinking about the relationship between critique and materialism. Because in some sense, I think Marx came up against a similar problem when, he made these grand pronunciations, I want to leave philosophy, I want to enter science, right? These kinds of, which within critical theory then comes back as Horkheimer's question of a kind of interdisciplinary materialism. How can we do something that is not philosophy? And for me, those questions were all there for me, with especially your final turn kind of so I think the question that I think Chris also asked around the disciplinary, to me, and also the question of praxis that came up at the very beginning of the Q&A is really important, because I wonder, is it, don't we have to address also the problem of idealism and materialism if we want to grasp a little bit this question of what does a kind of philosophy look like that is not philosophy in the major key or however. Yeah, sorry, that was long.
Yeah, I mean, to start by your question, and then I'll go back to Hammam's. I think indeed that's where I was heading to, because I wrote a lot of these ideas keeping in mind Althusser's, writings on philosophy and materialist philosophy. What is a materialist philosophy? And I think that one of the things that often contemporary critical theory doesn't often seem to be able to deal with is precisely the critique of philosophy that it encapsulates. So because it's so much oriented to the practical, or to the question, to the later Marx, because it goes through the Frankfurt School, and so it goes to it takes up the question of critique from a certain angle. And by doing so, in a way, maybe what's kind of vanishes is actually the sedimented critique of philosophy that is also part of the concept of critique. And I think that's what I wanted to kind of bring forward. However, the critique of philosophy in Marx is extremely different from the critique of philosophy in the terms I've presented, the anthropological or this sort of, it's a different kind of distancing from philosophy. But in a way, I'm interested in how you bring this meaning, this other meaning of the critique of philosophy to bear on this whole tradition of thought. And so, yeah, I think it's, and so the question of, idealism, materialism, maybe I would pose it more as these sedimented layers within the concept of critique, which are used, as this analogical or model-based use of critique means that there is a historical layering in it, which I find we have to grapple with if we want to do global critical theory. That's it, I guess. And about Serre, indeed, I mean, I used exactly this expression, relative exteriority. Indeed, it comes from my reading of Serre, though it was actually Peter Osborne who suggested the title of this little translation. Sorry for those who don't know this text, but basically, so indeed, in my outlook, I'm very much influenced by, I think, French historical epistemology, broadly speaking. And Serre is the one I know most, the early Serre. Precisely, Serre did try and theorize what it meant for Leibniz to philosophize with science, and philosophize science. And what he found so interesting with Leibniz was that Leibniz, because at the time of Leibniz, philosophy and science were not separated, his use of science and paradigms and models from science is kind of direct. It's not two discourses that meet. There is a sort of direct putting to work of scientific concepts. And he also theorizes, I think the concept of translation is really very much, I mean, that's how I said it in the talk, that when you talk about Fanon as performing translation on from a translation from, for example, the concepts of Marxism, or coming from Sartre, or from the kind of European philosophy, you put him in a position of relative exteriority, so neither inside nor outside, and the question is whether, I mean, what is beyond the formula in a way, or is there? It's a sort of way of dealing with the problem of this derivative character, which is in a way quite formal. But it's not by chance that I go back to Serre and to questions of science, because the formal sometimes enables you to deal with cultural and the cultural, or the racial, or difference as such in a kind of better or easier way, right? So yeah, sorry, right.
Thank you. I think we have run over time, but for good reasons. But there is, just to draw your attention, a last comment that says, is there a Fanonian form of the parasite, which I would say you can take with you, unless you want to say something to that immediately. Thank you so much, Lucie. Thank you, everyone, for a great discussion. Lots of questions to keep thinking with. And thanks, everyone, for coming to the seminar, and hopefully see you maybe, if you're local or not far from London, at the annual lecture, which is in person, but we'll also always try to upload recordings on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much.
Thank you for all your great questions and appreciations, and thank you.